Good afternoon and welcome everyone, and thank you for your patience. We had a little bit of technical difficulty beginning the webinar this afternoon, the intro session this afternoon, but we do thank you very much for joining us once again. I'm David Wood with Early Music America. I'm the Special Projects Manager, and if you've joined us before, we welcome you back, and if you're new to the intro sessions, we welcome you for the first time. Today, we've got a few housekeeping things to take care of. If you are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions throughout the intro session, and we'll be holding most of those toward the for the end of the presentation. If you would like to communicate with me as the host of the meeting, if you have any technical issues, you can do that through the chat panel. And if we have an opportunity for you to ask questions verbally, we'll ask you to use the raise hand function to do that. You can find out about this webinar as well as future intro sessions and webinars and more at our website, earlymusicamerica.org. You can also find us on social media at facebook.com and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube. We have Early Music America pages on and channels on all of those platforms, and you can find out the latest from us and from around the early music community by visiting us on social media. And if you would like to find out about upcoming interest sessions and resources for early music in North America and beyond, you can sign up for our email. You can text early music to 42828. So send a text to 42828 with the word early music or words early music with no space in there. Or you can use the button at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org and you can fill out the form to receive the newsletter tomorrow. And that newsletter goes out once a week on Tuesdays, and we'll have a follow-up for this interest session with links to the archived version on YouTube. We also welcome everyone who's joining us live on Facebook right now. If you have questions, you can submit those via the comments in the Facebook live stream. So I'd like to welcome today our guest presenter, Guillermo Salas-Suárez, who is joining us from Costa Rica today and will be giving our presentation. Guillermo, thank you very much first for suggesting this very intriguing topic, and also for making time to join us today and to share your knowledge about this subject.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much, Early Music America, for finding this topic interesting and giving me the space to do it. I'm very excited to do it.
Well, great. So if you have, once again, if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can submit those using the Q&A or the comments on Facebook Live. And I'm going to disappear, but I'll still be here if anyone needs me via the chat. And Guillermo, as you need to progress through your presentation, feel free to just let me know when to start the slide and when to move on.
Sounds good. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to talk so much about performance itself, but we're going to talk about the social background that supported Latin American colonial music. This is a repertoire that many people have an interest on right now. It's a hot topic for researchers. And so we're going to talk about how we can understand this music a little bit better through the social lens that that surrounded it. Even though it is European music, its context in the New World is vastly different, with a lot of social structures that are particular to the colonies, and that I believe really make a difference in how we should approach this music. It's also interesting, we didn't know this when I submit the proposal for this project to EMA, but the topic is just as current as ever. right now, because what we're going to be doing is addressing racism as a platform upon which social colonial society rested, really. And how music was a way for artists back then that perhaps came from the lower classes to really not let the system consume them and have a better life, really. David, can we start the presentation? And just finally, really quickly, I would like to also thank Early Music America for their interest in diversifying the contents that they're putting out. I'm thinking, of course, about the wonderful talk that Patricia and Neely gave a few weeks back on diversity in the field of early music in the States. The concert offered by Sarah Cranor and Tonos del Sur that was broadcasted last weekend. And personally also to just Eleanor Ligo for encouraging me to do this. But I have a lot of things to cover, so I better start. David? Thank you. So our story begins with a man named Ignacio Jerusalem. Ignacio Jerusalem was an Italian violinist who was working in the port city of Cadiz, Spain, as a theater musician. And in 1742, Joseph Cárdenas was a Mexican entrepreneur who was in Spain recruiting musicians for his theater back in Mexico. The Teatro Coliseo was the name of this theater. He made acquaintance with Jerusalem, offered him a job, and a year later, Jerusalem packed his belongings to the New World. Jerusalem, or actually Jerusaleme, was his original last name with G and double M. When he moved to Mexico, he found himself pretty much unchallenged in his skill, and he quickly started climbing the social ladder. He intermingled with the cream of society and amassed a reputation as a composer of talent. And then eventually applied for the single most important job post in New Spain, and that was the chapel master of the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City. And he got it. He had his high profile allowed him to get this job, but not without certain hassle, because the clerics back then felt uneasy about two things. One was that he was not so well versed with church music or just working for the church, and also the fact that he came from theater, that he was a theater musician. As we will see, full-time musicians in Mexico City in the 18th century, they were in high demand by a diversity of sectors. And some of these sectors happen to be at odds ideologically sometimes, such as the church and the theater. And so musicians needed to be intelligent to be able to navigate these different spheres if they wanted to be successful at them. And so in a society with very stiff classes or castes, as we will call them, music and violin, I would argue, specifically violin, provided a very important avenue for social mobility. Can we go to the next presentation? Slide, David, thank you. So just we have a better idea of New Spain. What was New Spain? Here we have a map. It's a little bit later. This is from 1794. I'm talking mostly about around the second half of the 18th century. However, it does give us a good idea of what the Spanish colonies happened to be then. Basically, the Vice Kingdom of New Spain went all the way up from Northern California down to Costa Rica. And actually, after Costa Rica, those territories were also Spanish, but they belonged to a different Vice Kingdom called the Vice Kingdom of New Granada. The only difference in this map with what would have been a map from 1750 would have been Louisiana, and a lot of these purple areas that you see, in 1750, that would have been French. Those would have been French territories, and they didn't become part of Spain until 1763, when Louis XV basically gave them away to Britain and Spain in order to end the 7 Years' War. Now, in the center of the green area, you see a little circle. That's where Mexico City is, or the very loyal and very noble city of Mexico, as they said, la muy noble y muy leal Ciudad de México. That was the capital of the Vice Kingdom then, and it is the capital of Mexico today. And this is where most of our story takes place, because we need, in order to support this plethora of musicians, we need a lot of urban institutions. And of course, we are gonna find them the strongest at the capital. Next slide. Thank you. So the first time we encounter the word violin in the cathedral archives is in 1709. In 1709 is the first time we see appearing the word violin. But 20 years ago already, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, that famous nun and writer and intellectual of the time, she mentions violin in a poem, along with a long list of other instruments. The cathedral was by far the best employer for musicians back then. And not only did they have a stable salary, but they also had a lot of privileges that basically no one else provided. And that meant that the cathedral was able to score the best musicians, really, in town. But it wasn't just about talent. If a musician wanted to get a job at the cathedral, there was another set of perhaps more metaphysical qualities that they needed to present in order to get it. Can we go to the next slide? So colonial society rested on the concept of purity of blood, or pureza de sangre. And what purity of blood means is basically the more Spanish the blood, the higher the rank a person could qualify for. And notice that I say qualify and not just have. And we're gonna come back to this in a moment. But yeah, and so this system basically yielded all these different castes that populated the colonies, and they all have different characteristics depending on who the parents were. So up in the top of the pyramid were, of course, the Spaniards. David, can you click once? Thank you. So the Spaniards were the most affluent caste of all, the most important ones, the most respected ones, all the highest posts were reserved for them. Then after the Spaniards, we have the criollos. Thank you. These were basically the first generation Spaniards born in the colony. A lot of them were rich and educated, but they didn't command the same kind of respect that their parents had. And also they didn't have access to some of the most important jobs. And they were basically the ones who are gonna drive a lot of the independence movement later on. Then we have the mestizos, I think. Yes, or half-blood. And this was the combination of a Spaniard and an Indian parent. Mestizos, they usually were employed in trivial jobs. And already here, we start seeing pretty heavy racism towards the castes. Then after mestizo, we have the Indians. Which were the native peoples, obviously. They were pretty low rank, and they were usually employed as servants. So these are kind of like one of the most important castes. And then we have like all sorts of permutations. For example, we have the mulattoes, which were the combination of Spaniard plus black. And then we have something called cuarterón, which was the combination of a mulatto and a Spaniard. Cuarterón basically meant a quarter mulatto. We don't see this terminology very often, but I wanted to, the next one, the next caste, I find it interesting. The next caste is something called tornatraz. And what I find interesting in this painting that you see here is that tornatraz, which literally means backward looking, and they were the offspring of a cuarterón plus a Spaniard. This cuarterón is playing a violin. Can you click once, David? He's playing a violin, which leads us to the question, who played the violin then? Next slide. So here we have some figures. This is the ethnic composition of the Cathedral Music Chapel in the second half of the 18th century. We see we had 32 criollos, 13 Spaniards, 4 Europeans, most of them Italians, 2 mestizos, and 1 Indian. So it's pretty high class, you know, criollos, Spaniards, Europeans. That was the bulk of the chapel. Eventually, they would invite a few street musicians to join them. In fact, this is guitar musicians. We know that they were invited to be part of the Corpus Christi celebration, which back then it lasted a full week. But the guitar was actually never part of the core of the chapel. It was like a guest instrument. And the thing is, a lot of the chapel musicians, they felt troubled to play with street musicians because a lot of them had a mestizo or Indian heritage. However, we have some notable exceptions that we will see in the next slide. So these are 2 Indian or mestizo organists who were admitted into the chapel. They were Juan de Velasco in 1746 and Domingo Esteban de la Mota in 1751. Both of them were caciques, that is, they were Indian political leaders. They were the highest rank among their kind. And they were given this opportunity to study organ and be part of the most important music ensemble of the Vice Kingdom, which is really quite extraordinary. They must have had an amazing talent, for sure. But at the same time, had they not been caciques, it would have been possibly just very difficult for them to attain these jobs. But they are examples of how people that couldn't claim purity of blood as a springboard to do well in life. This is an example of how these people used other concepts to help them in life. Can we go to the next slide? And here's where we see the concept of calidad. Calidad could be translated as social quality, and it refers to an aggregate of attributes like employment, institutional rank, personal connections that gave an all-encompassing impression of a person's reputation. And this is why I said that just being Spanish or just being a Spaniard didn't really make your life just easy by default. You had to curate your persona through different calidades. You basically have to, in a way, have a resume with all these other tangential, but at the same time, crucial components, which spoke what kind of person you were. And this is exactly how the lower classes advance, usually through pursuing an academic degree or following the clerical path. Those were classic examples on how a person of a lower rank could get a better life, for example. If you were, as we saw, a cacique, or if you were a cacique son, then you would also have better chances to climb the social ladder. A lot of people actually also bought fake Spanish ancestries and did all sort of illegal things, but things that were harder to disprove in the time. Can we go to the next slide? So foreigners found their way to New Spain, and a lot of these foreigners were actually Italian violinists. They established themselves in the most important churches of the Vice Kingdom, not just Mexico City, but also Valladolid, Puebla, Durango. And they become a very important revolutionary, if you will, influence in Mexico and the colony, because they become a very important influence in the Vice Kingdom, because they are bringing an instrument that is Italian. You know, it's very trendy. And not only are they doing that, but they start composing in a new style, the galant style, and they feature the violin heavily in these compositions. So they update the Mexican sacred music and with this new style and this new instrumentation, and they institutionalize the violin into the very fabric of music, of the Mexican sacred music of the time. Next slide, please. What kind of music did they play? they played, for example, they played obviously what the chapel master composed. So that would be kind of like a regional repertoire. So we have a few examples here: Ignacio Jerusalem, Manuel de Sumaya, Antonio Juanas. A lot of these people were foreigners, either Spaniards. Ignacio Jerusalem, as we saw, was Italian. Manuel de Sumaya was actually the first criollo to get this job. And they also played older music. They played the music from the Spanish polyphonists, such as Tomás Luis de Victoria, Francisco Guerrero. 150 years after they were dead. And they were playing also some secular music, Corelli, Leclerc, Locatelli. And these three, Corelli, Leclerc, Locatelli, we find them in a manuscript at the Cathedral Manuscript Archives. And they bespeak of, I think they bespeak of the high level of musicianship that these people had. They were playing very difficult music. And it also tells us about what they preferred, what kind of repertoire they favored. As we see here, they liked, obviously, Spanish music. They liked Italian music, Mexican-Italian music, if you will, and a little bit of French as well. Not so much German. We'll start seeing some German influence towards the end of the century, but not quite yet. And this also tells us about the access to European masters and to all music, and what they consider was good music. Next slide, please. So the cathedral was just one actor in a very active center, urban center. Back then we had churches, convents, monasteries, schools, the army, theaters, aristocracy, all really, really different social spheres that demanded musical services. And we see a lot of the same people, the highly sought after musicians, playing for all of them. But the thing is that at least the people from the cathedral musicians, they were not allowed to do that. The cathedral forbid them to take outside gigs. I suppose they, with what they received with the cathedral should have been enough, but that wasn't always respected. In fact, it was seldom respected. And sometimes the clerics would find out, and sometimes they found out and they would suspend the musician or cut ties with them altogether, because the cathedral was a very powerful and important institution that needed to preserve a sense of grandeur, and it needed to command respect, and it also needed everyone that was associated with it to be aligned with their set of values. It didn't make sense that you played a mass and then the next day you were at the tavern, playing for drunk people and getting drunk yourself and doing all things that, it just didn't make sense ideologically. But it was a little bit harder with the aristocracy. What would you do with patrons, with very rich patrons who supported the church and who also wanted to have music at their homes? This is what we're going to see in the next slide. This is Miguel de Berrio y Saldívar. Marqués del Jaral, Marquis of Jaral, a very capable amateur violinist. He hosted chamber music soirees at his palace, and a big music lover all around. He had over 1,300 works in his personal library. He had so many instruments. I think he had like 25 violins of makers such as Stradivari, Amati, all the big ones, supposedly, or at least according to his will, which we have preserved. And a lot of the music here that he had is basically the same kind of rep that we saw from the cathedral: Mexican, Italian, Italian, French, etc. Ignacio Jerusalem was probably involved in this chamber soirees as a player and as a composer. And because he was associated with people like the Marquis, then the church starts, or the cathedral starts being a little more lenient towards letting the players perform for other people. Because if you play for someone like the Marquis, then you were getting access to a wealth of resources and really just improving your skills by playing with different good musicians. So that was beneficial for the cathedral too. Next slide, please. The nobility, for example, they practiced music as a hobby, as an enlightened hobby, and as a way to advance some political agenda. Criollos and Spaniards, they hosted music evenings in which they were able to show off their material power. And they saw music as an edifying activity that portrayed them in a very positive light, forward-looking, and just aligned with the set of values from the Enlightenment. This picture here, this is interesting because here we have a criollo playing the violin. What we saw in that painting before, there was a cuarteron, there was a lower class person playing the violin. And this is already telling us a lot of who's playing the violin. Next slide, please. Outdoor entertainment obviously happened as well. And they were also hosted by Spaniards and Criollos. And these gatherings were called Saraos. In Saraos, people gathered and they exchanged ideas, read poetry, listened to music, danced, enlarged their network, all sorts of things. And this is another example of how musicians from lower ranks, they were invited to be part of higher circles of influence. These people that, given their original rank, wouldn't have had the chance or the opportunity to intersect with people, with forward-thinking people, and with new ideas, the ideas that are coming from Europe. These musicians had the opportunity to be exposed to all of this. It's just not a gig. It's just not getting paid more on the side. It's also really an education, what they're receiving, and I'm sure all sorts of other privileges from rich people. And actually, yeah, the cathedral archives, they record a lot of their musicians taking part of these saraos. Next one, please. Finally, the last social sphere that we're going to talk about is the theater. The theater was a very important actor here. It mobilized the masses, really, because it put on shows of comedies that were open to all public, whoever could pay. And this means that in theaters, basically all castes were mixed together. It was possibly the only place that functioned almost as I'm not going to say melting pot, because I think still the castes were still operating within their own limits. But nowhere else did you really see that that mixture of all castes. And especially the higher classes, they were suspicious about this. They thought that theaters were just pandemonium, that they were just not a decent place to be. And this is exactly what the cathedral thought as well. But as we saw, they did hire someone from the theaters, such as Ignacio Jerusalem, and they hired other people as well, such as Gregorio Panseco, was another Italian violinist who came from the theater. They hired him in 1761, and Manuel Aldana, they hired him later on. And just in the later part of the century, the cathedral starts being more tolerant and just care more about what kind of musician the person was. Manuel Aldana he's interesting because he's criollo, and he's a little bit later, one generation later, and he was called the Latin American Pleyel. He was a very esteemed composer. Diario de Mexico, it's a newspaper from the time, says that we don't know anyone else a better composer than Manuel Aldana. And Manuel Aldana is someone that embraces the newer classical style. In fact, his sonatas for violin and guitar are possibly the first examples of the classical style being written by a Mexican. Next slide, please. So we're gonna wrap up. The rigid framework that was operating in New Spain with the caste, with all these castes and the caste system, the construction of race and status in New Spain proved to be a very complex phenomenon, especially because even if in the outside we have these very stiff demarcations, people were still finding strategies to bend the system. And viceregal violinists understood this, and they took advantage of it, really. And they did it with the violin. They understood that the violin had a very versatile reputation. Basically, any one of the castes could claim the violin to be their instrument. And so it was something that they all had in common, and that made it easier for someone from a lower rank to who wants to go up thanks to the violin, because it's something that they have in common, and it's an activity that the higher classes are supporting. They think it's enlightened, forward-looking. And really, this is a way how some of these people were able to negotiate their identity, this colonial identity, which didn't only depend on decency and race, but as we have seen, of calidad and music talent. So successful violinists in New Spain saw these vacuums in the system, took advantage of them, really, and they were able to get access to privileges that their original caste wouldn't have given them. That's what I have for you today. Thank you so much.
So we do have a few questions. One of the questions we had about 10 or 15 minutes ago that was submitted, do anything about surviving violins from the area, I'm assuming, of the 18th century?
So I'm pretty sure there are. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are a couple at the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. But some of these impressive violins that I was talking about, what we know is actually from documents, like the Marqués de Jaral. He had a will in which he said, I'm gonna give this to this person, this to this other person. And the cathedral itself bought a bunch of those instruments when he died. So that's a lot of the evidence that we come across, you know, that other people saying we have these instruments.
Okay. Also, someone was asked, interested to see a woman playing the violin at the Saraos. Can you comment on the circumstances when women of any caste could play music?
Yeah, fascinating question. So one sphere that I didn't mention today was convents, but there's actually, we have some information about nuns who play the violin, who had orchestras in their convents, and who had libraries. You know, they were playing Vivaldi, they were playing Corelli. The person, the scholar who's worked on this, her name is Josefina Muriel. I can put it in the chat if you want. Josefina Muriel. So those are the convents. And yeah, this particular instance of the woman playing in the Saraos, to me, it's a little bit enigmatic to me, because most of what we see is men playing string instruments. Women, a lot of the women, higher castes women, they prefer to go for keyboard instruments because the keyboard was an indoors instrument, and you know it offered them a way to be, let's say, artistic, but at the same time modest, and at the same time, you know, just not stepping outside of their circle of influence, which should be the home or the house. So yeah, the woman that we see in the Saraos, I'm not really sure what kind of person could have been possibly just a daughter of the rich criollo who was hosting the Saraos. But yeah, I'm not totally sure.
And sort of coalescing several statements that have across a few different platforms in here. Can you just talk a little bit about how you began this research, and you know what has inspired you? What are some of the sources that you found to be particularly beneficial, and those types of things?
Yes. So this project actually began at the Early Music America Young Performers festival from like 2 or 3 years ago. Case Western Reserve was playing, and I met Benjamin Juarez, who's a board member also of EMA, and we were just talking about what kind of research topics I was interested, and I said colonial music, and he offered very graciously. He offered he works at Boston University, and they have the microfilms from all the music that's preserved from the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City. So he offered that to me, to do research. And because I'm a violinist myself, so I naturally was inclined to do secular instrumental music, but obviously a lot of what we see is vocal and sacred, of course. So I landed on this manuscript roll that had the Corelli, Leclerc, and Locatelli. It also had other stuff by Leonardo Leo and Antoine Mahot. And it's like one of the few rolls in the entire collection of just instrumental music. And I decided to do my lecture recital, my first lecture recital at Case, to explore the social background behind this manuscript.
I have a question about how to find works by some of the Mexican composers, such as Manuel Aldana.
Yes, in fact, they're not so easy to find. So a lot of what I came across was actually through a source by Belarusian scholar who works in Mexico. She lives in Mexico. Her name is Evgenia Robina. I can also put it in the chat. Evgenia. Oops. She has a lot of work on strings in colonial Mexico, and she actually has a work on Manuel Aldana and another violinist whose name is, I cannot remember right now, but two turn of the century musicians and violinists, and she has a whole monograph on them, and she transcribes some of his music. So this is how I came across his sonatas for guitar and violin. Unfortunately, the source that we have, there's only, if I'm not mistaken, there's only just the violin part or the guitar part. One of them is missing. Yeah.
This is kind of a segue. We'll be talking a little bit more about sources for music by Black and Brown composers in Latin America in 2 weeks, our next interest session, with Henry Lebedinsky and Maria Romero, who will be talking about that. And also EMA has just created a new section, a resource section on our website that we're actually hoping to get more submissions. We have resources and some other things that have started, but we've also have a form there for people to submit for what they've found. And this is, and I'll post this in the chat also, resources for diversity in early music repertoire, to help sort of identify some of these sources that are so far have been outside of what people have put in the kind of main sources, and we want to open up those discussions, have more of this music played, and so we're hoping that others can benefit and also share their own expertise to help us flesh this out and grow that even more. So anyone is invited to submit composers that they know of or resources. You don't have to know how to find their music, just beginning with even knowing composers by name. So yes. Are there other questions? There aren't any in the chat. We have a couple more minutes left that we could take a few other questions. And while we're waiting for any questions to come in, Guillermo, where is your research taking you next? Are you going to expand on this? Are you moving into a new area?
So I need to prepare for my second and final lecture recital at CASE as part of my doctoral degree. I was interested in actually tracking really the historical sources that tells us about the guitar in the New World, because we have some conflicting evidence. We have Spanish and actually Mexican guitar treatises, but then when you go to a lot of the sources, you just don't see the guitar ever being mentioned. So it's I think it's sort of a research lacuna right now, because a lot of people who concentrate on this kind of repertoire, they automatically play this repertoire with guitar, which makes sense. The guitar was really ubiquitous in the continent. But then when you go to a lot of the sources, you just don't find it. So that's a possible idea that I would be interested in exploring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't see any other questions, and I'm sure some of you have noticed, and we can help pass on any of your questions to Guillermo if you come up with other things later. This will live on Facebook, and then we will have this also archived on our YouTube channel. I'll put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat in Zoom with all of the rest of our webinars and intro sessions that we have presented, as well as the concert that Guillermo mentioned, and all of our past Young Performers Festival concerts. So you can see Case performing from a few years ago. They're on our website, on the YouTube channel, that is, to find out more about this and these other performances. Thank you everyone for joining us today. The registration is already open and available on our Facebook page and at earlymusicamerica.org for our next interest session in 2 weeks. And we'll be sending out information through our newsletter about that as well tomorrow in the next couple of weeks, if anyone's interested in joining us next time. Guillermo, thank you so much for shedding light on this subject that I'm sure many in attendance haven't known anything about up to now, and we're so glad that you were able to take the time to share this with us.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much everyone who joined us today.
Right. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you at a future interest session in 2 weeks or at another time in the future. Thank you.